All right, well, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining our 11th session for Identity Access Management. This is a study group, and as always, I like to start with a little disclaimer. I have been studying this content, and I share with you what I've learned. And so just make sure that if you see anything that doesn't look quite right, please let me know. Maybe I made a mistake. And I try to give us links, especially in the quizzes, so that when we're taking them together, if there's any questions as to where the question came from or the information, we can verify it. And definitely anytime throughout the session, if you have questions, comments, or your own experiences on how you've used this information, feel free to interrupt and just make it an interactive session. Don't worry about just me continuing on, and I'll check to see if you guys have questions. So I think this is our third session on OAuth flows because it's a fairly extensive topic for Salesforce and generally for applications for integration. Today, we're going to look at authorization with session management for hybrid apps, SAML assertion flow, and a few server-to-server flows. At the end, I have a quiz with 14 questions. If we're not able to get through it, I will publish the quiz and you'll be able to do it on your own. And we'll see if we can do it together or not, because there's actually a lot of content for today. I expect we'll have one final OAuth flow session for next week. And then beyond that, we're going to move to other topics. So last week, we covered the first column that you see here. So all of these sessions, actually, I guess it was 2 weeks ago, we covered the authorization code credentials. We focus on authorization code, different variations of them. And if you have questions about these, the video is posted on YouTube, so are the slides and so are the quiz, but these page numbers come from that presentation. On today's session, we're going to be covering the middle column, and these numbers are the slides as well. And so originally, when I was studying for this, I was using LadiesB Architect, which is an amazing resource. But in the meantime, since those were published, which was back in 2018, Salesforce has added considerably more functionality. And so I definitely recommend those videos from Carly because they're really, really good. I love how she explains the concepts, but make sure you don't depend on them because there's a lot more content that you want to study as well. Has anybody here been using the LadiesB Architect videos?
Not yet.
Okay, well, there's 2 sessions that are done by Carly for OAuth flows. Those are really good. The way she explains them, the different actors, and the way she organizes them is fantastic. It was very helpful for me. I used to watch them when I was on my bike in the morning exercising because it kind of helped lay a foundation. And then I went through the documentation and studied it to expand the knowledge on it. But she's amazing at putting them together. All right, so let's start with the first one. So the first one is looking at hybrid apps. And so this is the not all of these, most of these are OAuth 2.0 authorization flows. And what this one is really trying to do is if your app has its own web session and you're also using access tokens independently, you end up having to do a lot of juggling to maintain that session management. They'll expire at different times, and then you have a problem with just a bad user experience. So due to that, Salesforce has provided this particular flow that basically creates a bridge between the access or refresh tokens and the web session. And what that's doing is it will basically simplify it for your app so that you don't have to worry about the web session management, and you can lean on Salesforce to get that done for you. This does use as a basis, the user agent flow that uses the implicit grant type. That is not a recommended flow because it does have some issues, but that is what this uses. A couple of distinctions is this flow is going to use the grant type hybrid token, and it's used to access resources for things like sites, Lightning, and Visualforce. And so those scopes are going to be web for Lightning, content for sites, Visualforce for Visualforce pages, or Visualforce sites. And also the other scope that you want to include in your connected app is refresh token if you want your app to be able to do that. All this information, and we're going to go through the flow in just a second, when you've gone through the authentication process and Salesforce finally returns the access token to you, it's going to include session ID information. And that session ID information is what puts everything together for you. Once you've done that, at that point, then your token and your web session are in sync, and they're going to be expiring at the same time. And so when you use the refresh token flow to get the new access token, the whole thing gets renewed again. And so that's why you want to use this. This is particularly useful for web apps. If you're going to be refreshing your token, it is a little bit different in that you use a different grant type. You're going to use hybrid refresh. So basically anything around hybrid, you want to make sure you have hybrid token and hybrid refresh on your grant types to make sure that they're correct. So looking at the flows, and I've been using the Cloud Sundial flows extensively because they're great and I didn't see a reason to recreate them. And so this is the flow directly from there. So one of the things that's interesting is your hybrid client is going to be going through the process of requesting the access token with the grant types that I just described and the scopes that you're requesting. Once you do that, authentication is going to be performed if it's needed. And authorization. The token is what gives you back your session ID for your different scopes, and also it gives you your domain and your session IDs. Once you have that, the app is responsible for setting the cookies on the client side, right? So Salesforce is not doing anything with the cookies. That's something that you have to do yourself on your web application to make sure that the users are not going to have a bad experience with their session lifeline. Once they've been authorized, then they can use the resources like usual. This is going to be more than APIs, right? So you might be serving a Visualforce page or a Visualforce site. So you're using a little bit different resources than normal. And so what you get back with your access token and the details, it's going to be the scope. So this might be content_domain, content_SID. And if you have multiple scopes in your request, let's say you're requesting both Visualforce and content, you'd have a set for each. And so these scopes are really important because it's how you're going to be able to manage those resources. When you get back your access token, you get additional details, which are going to be your cookie name, the client, and the client source. And again, all of this is meant to help you set the cookies on your side. So questions on this one? Has anybody ever used it? I haven't. All right. And so on this one, just keep in mind for the hybrid app, this one I did it first today because it's a continuation of some of the other auth flows that we looked at last time. Like I said, it uses your, sorry, wrong way. It uses the user agent flow, which uses the implicit grant type. And then it gives you the ability to manage the web session with the cookie information. Let's go to the next flow. So the next one is technically not OAuth. So the SAML assertion, right? Just by the name, you can see it's SAML, and you're using this to access the APIs. So this is going to be based on the user's credentials and their profile that you're using. So if that profile has access to objects or Apex classes or APIs, that's what you're getting access to here. It may either be a human where maybe they're going to be logging into Salesforce and using that SAML assertion to get access to the resources, or you can create a user that's dedicated to a system user for an application. And that, of course, will have a human UI interaction with it. This flow can only be used if you have SAML enabled for that org. Again, that makes sense because you're sending the SAML assertion to Salesforce to be validated. This is the only integration path that does not use the connected app. And so if you get a question in the exam, which I did not, about which ones use a connected app, just all you have to remember is SAML assertion does not, everything else does. There is a flow called SAML assertion bearer that is different. So do not combine them in your head, keep them separate. And this is the only one that does not use a connected app. If you do use this particular flow, it does not invoke login flows. We looked at login flows probably about 8 weeks ago, where after the user is authenticated, if you have any custom login flows enabled, they're going to be put through those flows. And depending on how your flow is built, it will either allow them to bypass it or reject them if they don't complete it. Experience Cloud does not support SAML assertion at all. The grant type is assertion, which is pretty easy to remember. It does not support refresh tokens. And this is an area where we talked about last time. The way that OAuth is used in Salesforce is not necessarily the general world use of OAuth. So in the general world, all OAuth flows support refresh tokens, but in Salesforce, quite a few don't. So just keep that in mind when you're working with this, that you want to make sure which ones offer refresh tokens and which ones don't. If you have a human UI login, it would include direct user authentication for them to actually get authorized and then authenticate first and then authorize the resources you're trying to use. And if you're using the server-to-server integration option, then the client app is generally generating the SAML assertion directly for that specific user login that you're using. And that's why it can be for either a human that's actually using the application that you're using, or it can just be your client app generating its own SAML assertion and sending it into Salesforce. So that flow, and again, Cloud Sundial is great. They're only showing part of it, but the client is going to generate the SAML assertion and send that as part of the request for the access token. That goes to the token endpoint, and the grant type is assertion, like we said earlier. If that is validated and successful, they get back their access token, and then with that access token, they can use a resource server. This authorization here is Salesforce. Theoretically, this could be another IDP. It does not have to be Salesforce as the IDP. It could be an external IDP that grants the access token, and once that access token is authorized or generated, then you can use it on Salesforce. This one is also one that I have not used. There's other more secure options, so this one is also not one that's particularly desired. Any questions on this one? All right, let's keep going. So I group them because for me, it's easier to group things that are similar to each other when I'm learning and memorizing information. And so I grouped 4 of the flows that are all server-to-server integration flows. These are all OAuth 2.0 flows. And this is really when you don't want somebody, a human, to be in the middle of these flows. None of these provide a refresh token. And again, this is specific to Salesforce. And so the 4 flows are the username and password flow, the SAML bearer assertion flow, which I mentioned a little while ago, the JWT bearer flow, and the client credentials. And we'll look at them individually. And again, all these 4 are very similar in how they work. They just have little nuances between them. So the username and password flow, this one is where in your request, you're going to have the grant type of password, and your request includes the username and password. And depending on how you're passing that information, it can technically be clear text. And so it's not considered to be secure at all. You need to make sure that you're using this really within an internal application that's going directly to Salesforce. And if you have your firewall set to only allow traffic through certain API, IPs and that kind of thing, that's really when you want to use this. This one should be very rarely used because it has a lot of security holes in it. And again, you're exposing those credentials, so make sure that you limit the access of that user. So if you do have to use it, the user that you're using, they should have very limited access. They should not be a system administrator. A lot of people do that with API logins, right? But it should not be a broad profile because you're really putting that out there into the internet. This one, it will not show up on the connected apps OAuth usage, which also means that you cannot revoke this access. So once it's been used and they have been granted the access token, you cannot revoke it. You have to wait for that session to expire before it will actually be ended. And again, it depends on the user's profile and role. So if they have access to all the data in your org, so does this application, because now you've given them that permission. It does not support you setting scopes or refresh tokens. The access you get is from the profile and role. And again, Experience Cloud does not support this flow. It's just not secure enough for them to allow it. And so here is the Cloud Sundial flow. It comes for your client app. It goes through the authorization server to the token endpoint. You provide your client ID, your client secret, which come from your connected app. You put in your username and password for that particular user that you're using to access Salesforce. And if all of that is correct, you get back your access token, and then you can use the APIs. And again, all of this is based on the user's permissions. Again, it requires a very high degree of trust between the client and the resource server. So you want to make sure that you're not using this with third parties or anything else like that, because that would be problematic. Instead, Salesforce recommends you use one of these 2 flows, either OpenID Connect dynamic client registration flow. And this is a flow that we're not going to talk about today. We're going to talk about it next week. Or web server flow with Pixie. And web server flow we talked about in last 2 weeks ago, that session, where that one uses the authorization code exchange for access token. And if you add the Pixie to it, it adds a great deal of security to it. So that's what's really recommended. So that's username and password flow. On this one, I have used it many years ago, where we had it into one of our AWS Java apps that was pulling information from Salesforce. We had a dedicated integration user for that application, and it was very locked on what it can see in the org. So it could really create and update its own records, but it couldn't see anything else in it. That app eventually got deprecated, so it never got upgraded to a new flow, but it was very straightforward. It's just not the most secure thing in the world to use. Does anybody have any questions or any comments? All right, let's keep going to the next flow. So the next one is the SAML bearer assertion flow. And so this one is, instead of using, in this one, you're going to create your connected app. You're going to register a certificate, so a digital signature. And once you've done that, your app is going to use that certificate to create a SAML assertion and sign it with a private key. Salesforce is going to use the public key to verify it. And if it's verified, then it's going to grant access to the resources. This grant type is SAML2 bearer. And on this one, it's going to allow the scopes based on previously approved scopes that the user has used. So for this one, the user has to be already assigned the connected app. Otherwise, they're not going to be able to use this. And like I said, that SAML assertion has to be signed with the private key that you've uploaded to the connected app, and it has to be verified before you can use it. So when we look at the flow, that's exactly what you're seeing here. The client is generating the app with the private key. Then it's being validated with the public key. And if it's verified, we return the access token with the scopes. The client secret is optional on this one. I was surprised when I was looking at it. So when you create your connected app, you give it to your application, but if they don't return it, Salesforce is perfectly fine with that. If the SAML assertion is correct, it lets it, it authorizes it, it returns the access token. And because you've uploaded the certificate, it has a higher degree of trust than the client secret that's there. I have not used this one myself, but it made sense to me when I looked at it. So let's go to the next one. So the next one is fairly similar. This one is the JWT bearer flow. This one, just like the SAML bearer flow, you need to create your connected app. You need to register your certificate under digital signatures. The grant type is JWT bearer. And this one's a little bit different. So if the connected app is set to users may self-authorize, then the scopes are based on the approval of that user of whatever they've done in the past to access Salesforce. So if whatever scopes they've had available in the past, they're able to use now. If the connected app is set to admin approved users or pre-authorized only, then the standard and custom scopes that are assigned to the connected app are returned. So this is a little bit different. The scopes depend on how you've allowed the connected app to be used by users. There is a feature called Manage API Access. You need to raise a case with Salesforce to turn that feature on. When that's been turned on, you're able to really limit who can use the APIs or connected apps in Salesforce, and it's a really great security feature to add. So once you've done that, all of your connected apps become admin approved users or pre-authorized only, and then this is true. But before you do that, you still have both options, and then the scopes are going to vary depending on that. So if you look at the flow, it looks pretty similar. All of these server-to-server flows basically start with the client. You go to the token endpoint. You pass through your appropriate grant type, which in this case is JWT bearer. And this one does require the client ID and the client secret, and as well as the token, the JWT token that you're creating with the private key, Salesforce will validate it against the public key. And then if it's valid, it's going to create the access token. And then again, give you back to the APIs. So you can see why I put these together, right? All of these are very similar. The flows look almost identical. What really changes is some of the details of how you're sending the assertion and the grant type. You're always hitting the token endpoint as well. That's it. Any questions so far? Let's go to the next one. So the next one is client credentials flow for server-to-server integration. And basically, I named all of these exactly how Salesforce has them named, even though some of them ended up a little bit redundant, but that way you see them. So this one allows the application to directly authenticate with Salesforce using its own credentials. So here, the client ID and secret from the connected app are required, otherwise you will not be able to authenticate. And once you have that information, it creates the access token directly by providing these credentials. The grant type is client credentials. And I love how all of these are so similar to the name of the flow, because that way it's easier to keep them straight in your head. And you need to specify the integration user to run the integration, right? So on the connected app, it's going to ask you, what user are you using for this particular flow? This is more secure than using a password flow, so it is one of the recommended ones to upgrade to. And this one looks exactly like the other flows we've been seeing for server to server. The client app goes to the token endpoint. The grant type is client credentials. You provide the connected app information. If that is valid against the connected app, then it's going to return the access token, and then you have access to the APIs. These scopes are all based on what you put into the connected app scopes. And even if you include the refresh token on those scopes, all of these server to server flows will not return the refresh token. So it lets you add it. It just doesn't actually include it when it returns it. So those are all the flows that we're going to cover today. I went through them pretty fast, and I have the quiz now. Do you have any questions, or do you want to review any of the flows that we've already looked at? All right, let's go to the quiz. If you guys haven't done this before, I'm going to put the quiz over here. And actually, before I do that, let me do one more thing. Because I got a little confused about something today, so I want to show it to you guys. I don't even know which account this one is, but let's go in there. To set up a connected app, you can go to App Manager. We're going to create a new connected app. And this is where you're going to enable your auth settings. And for now, we're going to do a fake domain. And some of these flows, like the JWT bear flow, this is not used at all ever, so it doesn't care what it is. You can put, as long as it's HTTPS domain name, it doesn't matter what it is. Some of those are interesting to me. Here is where you're going to do for your JWT bearer and your SAML assertion bearer flows. This does not jump out at me today. I kept missing it. It's not red, right? Because it's not required. But once you select that, here is where you upload your X509 certificate. And this is the public part of the key, because your client app keeps the private part. And that's how it creates the assertions. Once you upload this, then you're able to proceed and use it. So I just had a problem finding this, which is why I wanted to point it out. This is where you do your certificate. And again, out of all of the flows that Salesforce provides, only 2 let you do a certificate. So you may get a question, because I've gotten some feedback from other people. I didn't get one, but other people have, when they were asked, your security team has a requirement that when you connect to your client app to your resources, you have to use a certificate. Which flows do you use? this would be one to make sure that you understand when to use a certificate. Again, it's only two, and they both have bearer in them, so it's easier to remember. JWT token and SAML bearer assertions are the ones you're going to use. And depending on the other ones, all of these are different, right? So this is one when you're actually doing the work. If you're implementing this, you'd want to use either the Salesforce help or go through to make sure what you need to create for your different flows. Some of these are pretty straightforward. If you're using authorization code, you would use this, and then this allows you to use the Pixie. And then depending on what you select, it gives you different options. All right, just wanted to show you that really quick. So now let's go to the quiz. What's that? And so if you guys have not done this before, I'll put the link on our chat. And I very briefly looked at these questions today, but I wrote these about 6 weeks ago. So I'm going to take this with you guys and see what I remember. Last time we had the quiz, and SEC does not here. It was fun, but it was a very hard quiz because all of these flows get a little bit jumbled in our minds, right? So, and just like before, I've added the reference links to every question. So if you can, don't click on them until you're ready to see the answers. So. All right. We'll start. And like I said today, it's 14 questions. Why did I skip question 1? Let's go back. I don't know why I skipped question 1. I guess we don't get to see question 1 today. Question 2. How do you obtain session information for resources from a site on Salesforce? And I just realized the link gives you a hint. And so the link tells you it's a hybrid app flow. And so you'll implement the hybrid app flow as correct. And for sites, you implement the content scope. And you're going to be updating the cookie details from the content domain name and the content SID since you did the content scope. And you guys all remembered that Salesforce does not set the session cookies. So good job there. And I think this is one way I thought it was confusing that there is a web scope. So that is a valid scope, but web scope is for Lightning, not for sites. And sites are going to be the really even before Experience Cloud, those kind of sites that you're talking about. Questions? All right, let's go to the next question. Question 3. How do you obtain session information for Visualforce resources on Salesforce? Select 3 answers.
Hey, can you hear me?
Just like last time, you get the hint about the hybrid app flow. And so definitely implement the hybrid app token. For Visualforce resources, you use the Visualforce scope. And then your cookies are going to have the Visualforce domain name and the Visualforce SID on the response. All right, let's go to the next question. And I forgot to shuffle these questions, so they're going to be in order from when I wrote them. So for the hybrid token flow, what is used to bridge the web session from the response? Select 3 answers. And this one, because you're setting a cookie to create your bridge, all of your information comes from the cookie, the session ID cookie name, the cookie client source, and the cookie session ID client are going to be the 3 pieces that you get back from Salesforce. Once you have that information, you can update the cookies for your user, and then that establishes the web session. Let's go to the next question. What is true about hybrid app flow for web session management? Select 4 answers. And so on this one, the answer is it uses the hybrid token for grant type. It bridges the access token into a web session. It follows the same flow as user agent flow for desktop and mobile app. And the required scopes are web and refresh token. Next question. How do you obtain such information for Lightning resources on Salesforce? Oh, I have the wrong answers on this. Because it's not a Lightning scope. And I have 2 as Lightning scopes. Does anybody remember what the right one is? Because we're all going to get it wrong. And so the Lightning scope should have been web scope instead of Lightning scope. And so I'll fix this question before I publish the quiz out to everybody else. So sorry about that, guys. But the answer is web scope And then, of course, implement the hybrid app token flow. And then the cookies are going to have Lightning domain and Lightning SID. And I'm going to go to the page because I want to see something. This is where those links are really handy. It is Lightning. There's the content domain, Lightning domain. And that's what I wanted to see. It is Lightning domain and Lightning SID. It's not web domain and web SID. So that was my question. All right, let's go to the next question. What is true about hybrid refresh token flows? Select 3 answers. About 5 seconds. And so this uses the hybrid refresh grant type instead of the refresh token grant type. It replies with updates to your access token and your session ID details, because that's going to create your new web session. And then you would use that to update the cookies on your user that's using your application. And it follows the same flow as the hybrid token flow. And the reason this one's not correct, it was a tricky one, and they do this to you on the certification exam. It says the refresh token always uses the user profile session information, and that's not true. It depends on whether you've set the session information on the connected app, on the profile, or on your session policies. So depending on what you've set up, that varies. So that's why it's not always from the profile. It's a tricky one. Let's go to question 8. What is true about JWT bear flow for server-to-server integration? Select 4 answers. So JWT bear uses the JWT bear grant type. It does require the digital signature. It's this one and SAML bear assertion. The server-to-server flows never return a refresh token, so that's why that one's wrong. Permitted users can either be all users or admin approved users. This one does require a connected app because that's where you upload your certificate. So it's going to require a connected app for you to be able to manage the certificate and the scopes for your application. And this is true. It never returns the refresh token. Let's go to the next question. How are scopes defined for JWT bearer flow for server-to-server integration? Select two answers. This is the one where the scopes vary, where if it's admin approved, then you're going to get the scopes from the connected app. If all users may self-authorize, then the scopes are derived from prior approvals, which I thought was interesting. It's not just the current approval, but any resources the user has had access to in the past get combined. And so this one's a little bit different. So that's the two answers. And I've never used the JWT bearer token flow myself. So learning with you guys. Question 10. What is the flow for JWT bearer flow? And you want to put these in the correct order. About a second. And so first, your client app is going to create the JWT token with the private key. It's going to request the access token by sending the request to the token endpoint with the grant type of JWT bearer. Salesforce is going to validate that assertion with the public key. And if it passes, it's going to create the grant access token and send that back to you. And then the client app is able to access the protected data or the resources. Any questions on that one? No? All right, let's go to the next question. Question 11. What is true about JWT token in the JWT bearer flow for server-to-server integration? Select three answers. Fifteen seconds. And so I didn't mean to give you the answers right before this question, but I gave you most of them, right? So the client is going to sign it with a private key. The private key is the X509 certificate that you loaded to your connected app under digital signatures. And then the authorization server is going to check it against the public key to verify the request. And it's the private and public that you need to be careful with, and which one is using it. The client is always going to have the private key. Question 12. What is true about SAML bearer assertion flow? Select 4 answers. Ten seconds. So this one, we didn't cover all of it, but it definitely requires connected app because remember, only SAML assertion does not require the connected app, but the SAML bearer assertion does. Everything else does as well. This is the second flow that uses the certificate under digital signatures. It does not require a client secret, which is very surprising to me. It uses the token endpoint, and the client secret is optional on the request. We'll go to the next question now. Question 13. What is true about username and password flow? Select 3 answers. So on this one, it will directly obtain the access token by providing the username and password. It requires a high degree of trust between the client and the resource owner, since you're passing through the username and password as part of the request. And the grant type is password. Last question. So which flow is recommended over user password flow for external apps? Select 2 answers. Five seconds. And so the 2 are the web server with Pixie. This is the one that's going to use the authorization code exchange for access token with Pixie to improve security. And the second one is OpenID Connect Dynamic Client Registration Flow. This is one we have not covered that we'll cover next week. And these are just the ones that are recommended. You could easily use the client credential ones and user agent you don't want to use for this particular scenario. But this one, I'm not sure why it's not recommended because you could. It's still fairly secure. All right, so those are all our questions for today. There are 2 things that I need to fix on the quiz. and then I'll publish them. And then just like usual, I will post the video on YouTube. I'll share the slides, and then I'll also share the quiz for you to take again if you like. So I will stop recording our session. Maybe I lost my controls.